Okay, hi. We should be live now. Hello, Rita, and thank you for coming today. We will be talking about your new project titled Zukünftiges Denkmal für die geduldeten Afghanen. Roughly translated, that means Future Memorial for the Tolerated Afghans. This is a project where tulips native to Afghanistan are planted throughout Berlin, protesting the treatment of migrants and refugees from Afghanistan who stay in Germany. In your homepage, you also beautifully write about this. For each tolerated body, let's plant a cherished one. I find the title of the work so powerful. What inspired you to name it this way?
I think two things came together. First of all, thank you for having me, Sarai. And there's two relevant elements for me in the title, like, of course, the geduldeten Afghanen, since they're the people this is being done both to and for, had to be there. But to call it a memorial was a little bit inspired in how present the Erinnerungskultur is in Berlin's public space and how many memorials you have to the past victims or perceived victims of German history. And it felt a bit hypocritical that we were replicating similar attitudes in the present day without them being visible in the public space that we share. And then I called it Future Memorial because there's still this hopeful note that we won't have to build an actual memorial about this, that sending people back to a war-torn country, the unsafest country in the world, can still be changed and averted and be something for us not to collectively regret in the future. And so that's like the two ingredients that brought the title together.
Mm. And in this project that you started, which is a movement, a protest, an artwork, you're using nature and the symbolism that we project on it to become this demonstration. And what was the inspiration for the project in general? What brought you to the idea to protest peacefully like this with the tulips? And yeah.
Oh, that's a really complex and also personal answer, because some friends and housemates of mine were affected by Duldungs throughout their life in Germany, either by trying to structure their lives in a way that could prevent them from being geduldet after their first asylum requests were denied, or by actually receiving a Duldung and not being able to work or study or rent for a certain period of time. And this just makes you really angry, and really angry because it's not something you see discussed about in mainstream media at all. You know, like if you're involved in activist groups or have dear people to you that are betroffen, that are affected by this, then you end up knowing. But it was really striking to me how little this was a part of the public debate. And so this got me really angry. And the first solutions that I thought about to protest and put a mark on public space with this were not at all this poetic or peaceful. But there's productive ways to use your anger, and there's unproductive ways to use your anger. And at first it was just really unproductive solutions. And then I was thinking about this symbolism of the welcome body by the land, by the soil, and I thought that it could be a good strategy to go for a national plant or a national flower that could be both a symbol in Afghanistan, but also have a place here and be involved in and integrated in our public space. And then it was a really pleasant surprise when I found out it was a tulip, because it's a flower we're used to thinking as, and now attention with the quotation marks, I really mean it with quotation marks, but one of our own, like it's part of our environment, what we perceive as European, when in actuality it really does come from ancient Persia and was commercialized to Europe through an Ottoman Sultan. So it also has like this colonial like under narrative to it, and I liked that it was so complex. And then when I was discussing the idea with my housemates, one of them said that that was a really good idea because it's the red tulips are the flower of the Persian New Year in northern Afghanistan, and this just embedded the, like, first it solved a lot of choices that still had to be made, and then just embedded the project with that extra layer of meaning and identification. So we then were choosing, like, I was showing them the species of tulips that grow all over Afghanistan, and he was telling me which ones he recognized or not, and that's how these choices in the project took space. Then, of course, there was still the question of how many tulips to plant where. Does it make sense to make clusters, or does it make sense to just spread them around, which of course makes the project less readable. And ultimately, I just allowed myself to take these first 6 months of the project to make experiences and go for both solutions in different spaces and see how they result, like how well they work out. And yeah, I'm not sure if I answered your question or if you'd like me to elaborate on something.
I have a few questions that I would like to elaborate on, but perhaps for our audience, could you say a few sentences what a Duldung is?
Of course. A Duldung is essentially a suspension of a deportation order by reasons that are considered of force majeure. Like, so either this will separate a family beyond repair and put kids into foster care, or you are doing it really, this one I really hate. Either you're doing a technical Ausbildung, and so you're considered like that you're becoming part of the essential workforce in Germany, or you don't have the proper documents yet, or you're going through an appeal in your asylum request. So things that don't allow you to be deported. Mm-hmm. But this is a status that varies extensively depending on the Bundesland. So,
okay.
Yeah, so there's also a figure called the Duldung Light, which is what my friend got, where you're not allowed to work or study and have a much shorter stay permit than someone on a regular Duldung. You have the Ausbildung Duldung regarding the technical Ausbildungs. And ultimately, it can also be used as a tool of bureaucratical bullying, because there's people who have been living on 1 month Duldungs for years, you know, without being able to properly root their lives anywhere.
Cruel.
Just staying in, yeah, it's extremely cruel. Just staying in this forever limbo because their like asylum request doesn't fit the framework that the current European asylum policy designed, or border policy, more accurately.
Yeah, when I first heard the name Duldung, I thought that's such a strange name, but now I wonder if it's rooted in geduldet, tolerated, in which case it's also an awful name. But you spoke a bit about your friend who inspired partly the project. What was his reaction to this work that you're doing, and how involved was he?
He was really involved in this conceptualizing phase, because I was really afraid to involve him in a way that made him feel tokenized. Like this, for me, working in issues like this is my biggest fear, to feel like someone is, to cause feelings of dehumanization and just making someone else my vocabulary, like that's just, so I was really afraid in approaching him when I started thinking about doing the project, but he was just really excited and really supportive. And when he didn't want to add his name or to be more present than what he was, but he was bringing friends to like the planting events, and every time that there were people planting tulips in other cities, he would just like sending me like the reposts and the like screenshots from Instagram, like, oh my god, there's tulips everywhere. So yeah, I mean, that was one of my biggest ethical fears in approaching this topic, like not making him feel like a theme or a token. And I'm really glad that that's not what ended up happening.
It is a really a question for me concerning this project on how do you reflect on yourself, that you're taking this demonstration for the Afghani people in Germany, but you're not Afghani yourself. And you've also invited anyone to take part with the planting of the bulbs. And what are you doing to avoid the white savior trope?
I've been thinking about this a lot, and for me it's not so much about avoiding being a white savior, it's about not being a white Teta.
Teta,
you know,
is aggressor. Perhaps we can roughly
like,
translate that.
Not be a perpetrator. Not like to choose not to be a perpetrator, because ultimately this is what happens when people with a political power, which as citizens of the European Union, and not my case, but citizens of Germany, we have when we elect our governments that define our border policies that then like use them as justifications to undergo these actions. When we are not involved and are ignorant and complicit and don't manifest, we are just all being perpetrators or complicit perpetrators of this. So for me, this would be different if it had happened in the past and now I was talking about it, or if I was going into big diatribes about what's going on in Afghanistan right now. Like this would be another matter. But because the scale of this work is still fairly small and it came from the space of our shared domesticity, not only don't I feel like in the scale that I was concerned, I had the allies and the scrutiny that I needed. And I'm also, I mean, my name is not anywhere on the site or on the project. Like I'm trying to remain as invisible as possible, just articulating with the relevant entities or activist groups to be able to like do planting actions or spread the word. But I was equally concerned about how would it look like for me to be taking a critical stance on German people without being German. So this was a double-edged sword in a way. You know, of course, like now that I'm thinking of scaling up the project, I know that this is not enough, that I'm beginning conversations with activist groups that work either with the Afghani community or with the staying rights, like Bleibrechte, in Germany. And I would like to involve some Afghani artists in the design of the visuals of the project. This I don't feel like I have, like it's not my place of speech to be articulating that. But for me, it was much more about just not being a white perpetrator rather than a white savior.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think what you say is really true. We all have a responsibility, no matter where we come from. I was wondering also, how did you decide how many tulips to plant?
I remember having this conversation with Vivian Karina, like back in September.
Yeah.
Because there was a big question, and I do want to scale the project for the next autumn season. So there I'd like to plant a different number with a different symbolism. But for this first phase, I settled on the number of deportees and the mass deportations in Germany in 2019, which is the last complete year with recorded deportations. And that number was 361 Afghans. And again, because I like it can be a controversial number because allegedly the only people that can be deported out of Germany in these charter flight deportations are people who committed crimes. Mm-hmm. But because the way that Duldungs are attributed and that Abschiebungen are attributed is so dependent on the internal policy of the Bundesland, for some Bundesländer, not having documentation or accurate documentation is enough to deport you back.
That's awful.
And the thing is, it's awful, and also have you watched anyone try to deal with the embassy from Afghanistan? You know, like if you happen to be from a place where you weren't registered at birth, getting a passport is a nightmare. Like a nightmare. So this is really, really, in a lot of instances, arbitrary and cruel. And I don't know, we were at the demo against the last Abschiebung that happened earlier last month. And one of the women talking, that was a part of Association for Afghans in Germany, was saying that the fact that people go back forced and then are labeled as criminals is such a sort of shame and such an attack on their mental health, and it can be a source of rejection from the community that they belong to, from their family. It's a cruel bureaucratic machine. Like, this doesn't make any sense, and it's a war zone, and it's the unsafest country on earth. We shouldn't even be talking about sending people back. Like, it goes against the right to non-refoulement.
I think that makes it even more powerful that you chose this number, despite some people pointing out a controversy, because in that way you're also bringing this to light. So you were mentioning that I was familiar with the project also in the process, and I hope very soon to come to Berlin and to walk and see the tulips. But unless you're familiar with the project and you recognize this tulip as being native to Afghanistan, you don't know that this is a protest or also an artwork. Does that bother you?
For this stage, no, because I knew that for a season I would need to be trying different things out and making mistakes. And understanding where to grow the tulips, how to grow the tulips, during which season, and which avenues of communication work and which don't. Like, these were all things that were important to map out. So in this first stage of the project, when it was a more... I can only remember the Portuguese word now. It was a more bordered, like more contained, kind of almost prototype sample. Like, I'm okay with the fact that most people that didn't hear about it through either a signal messaging chain or through the website or through the few exhibitions that happened won't know about it. Like, I'm at peace with this. I would really like to change it for the next autumn. Like, I think artistically I am happy enough with the form that it achieved, the agency that it got through other people's planting hands, and the feedback and reactions and positive and negative criticism that I got. But socially, the type of impact that I wish this could have is still way, way, way down the road. So definitely thinking of better communication strategies for next autumn is on the menu.
What steps will you take to spread the word more? Or what steps are you also taking now?
So this first phase of the project was really good to understand which organizations are beschäftigen, involved and acting against this issue and organizing against this issue. And some of them had actually offered to do planting actions either in their cities or here in Berlin, but we just got into contact too late. So the tulips would no longer grow or would grow crooked. So it didn't really make sense to pick up that opportunity right now. But this is something I would definitely like to engage them in the next planting season. So it could also be better planned, have a press kit, like all these things that actions usually have that this time it didn't. Then I would also like to have just a lot more tulips and a better planting strategy, because I really realized that if you plant clusters of tulips in public space, especially if it's in an unexpected space, it's a lot more noticeable. And it's also easier to label. So I can't label each individual tulip with a small card, but I can write something on the floor if it's a group of 200 tulips. And finally, I had 2 press contacts that were pretty cool, but that I didn't get to use precisely because the action was too small. It was like a small newspaper in Rostock and a journalist from the WDR. So they would have been pretty cool, but they both said like, okay, but it would be better if either we had more time to plan what we say, or you had more organizations behind you. Mm-hmm. So to follow these leads would be ideal. And I would also finally like to have a more concrete way, rather than just suggesting programs in which people can volunteer, like what I did for the EMAF installation, to have a more concrete way in how people can organize to have a chance of changing the law. So that participants are not just like doing a feel-good, atoning for our collective passivity gesture, but can actually mobilize into something more meaningful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's so incredible, Rita. It's such a...
I've done it.
And I think also hearing you talk about it more, you really hear how the project demands knowledge and skills in different fields, gardening, organization, and even IT to coordinate the map and open the website that you did. How did you face those challenges?
With stress and anxiety, and panicking and calling people who know more about me. I have 2 good friends that studied horticulture, mm-hmm. So I had them help me understand how to grow and root the bulbs and what would be the best way to plant them and how, and what should I take into account to make sure they're not eaten, which is important. To the IT, I live in a wonderful house project that just so happens to have a lot of wonderful people, that just so happens to have a guy downstairs that runs a small business of websites and promo video production. So I just sat with him for 3 afternoons and did the websites and took my doubts out. Then when it came to the map, it was really important for me that it was like an open source software that took into account users' privacy. And then OpenStreetMap, from what I was reading, just felt like the best option. So I didn't want to use Google or Apple Maps. Mm-hmm. And the organization, I think that just comes with practice and the territory. And you just also understand what you have to organize for as you're feeling the lack of it. So like this communication aspect, for instance, I was so focused on having like a strong formal foundation on which to then build upon that I started the communication aspect and the spreading the word aspect like way too late. So it's not like this is completely without flaws or mistakes. You also learn what you have to organize for like along the way.
Yes. Okay. I was hoping that if it's all right with you, we could also talk a little bit about the behind the scenes, because I think it's unusual to do a project of this kind of scale as a student. I look at it from the sidelines and I'm so impressed and in awe of you. And so I really want to ask questions that please feel free not to answer if you don't want to, but how did you get funding? How do you reach out to organizations? How do you work on a project like this on that kind of scale with more people? What kind of advice do you have for somebody who would want to work on a project this scale in the future as well? It's a lot at once. We can break it up.
Yeah. The funding was not that much. Like it was funding I could save for. If I want to plant the number of tulips I want to plant for next summer, like autumn, which would be 17,000 something, which is the amount of people like Afghanis living in Duldungs in Germany, I would need funding. But for 361 tulips plus a domain, it's money I can save myself. So that's what I did. And I also wanted to have, because it was a lot to start out with. I wanted to have the creative freedom that comes with not asking anyone for the money with what you're doing, for what you're doing. So in the smaller scale, it was definitely the right decision, and it just took like 3 months of putting some money aside for my job to be able to then pay everyone for the right things. When it comes to partnering with organizations or finding the right collaborators, I think it's so much a point of just trial and error and actually being a bit shameless and reaching out, you know. And of course, I think it also depends so much with, I don't know, like moving through these topics, I really try to feel like I'm acting ethically and try to check in with myself, see what are my biases at play, and see if they're coming from a place of ego, internalized racism, blindness over my social and cultural capital or not. So like this inner work before you're reaching out to partners and reaching out to collaborators or participants, I think is really important, because authorship already gives you authority over whoever you're bringing in, and to be sure that you're deconstructing that and working on an equal footing. I think it, like for me, it's really important. For me, this needs to be a part of the process, even though I know it's not like logistical. And then after you've done this, or as you're doing this, just be kind of shameless and reach out. Just, you know. And usually organizations, after you get like a good contact in an organization, they will do this job of, oh, but you know who would be a really good partner for this? Like this youth organization for Persian kids, or that activist organization that organized this blockade last year, or then it just kind of floats. You don't need to do the entire mapping out, because after you find people that relate to what you're doing, they're also allies in doing this work with you. And what was your last question? Because there was the money, the partnerships.
I think you already answered it. It was, what advice do you have for people who would want to work on such a scale? So throughout this talk, I've been using different names to talk about the project: demonstration, movement, artwork, because it's so many things at the same time, and I think that's such a wonderful part of it as well. And I wanted to ask you how you name it for yourself. What do you call it?
Oh, I will give you a much more boring answer than what you just made it sound. I just name it the project. Because for me, the thing that is enticing about working in art, quotation marks, this is what we call art in the moment in history where we live, is the freedom. Just the freedom of creating things you feel a burn for. And sure, the project can fit all these different like name boxes, but I kind of revel in the luxury of the definition of the word project, because then of course there's an aesthetical and formal side, or like a conceptual side. There is definitely an action side, like when you're structuring like how many tulips will which organization get in which day with which press kit, like, you know, like this part is already very political activism message, like much more in that direction. The website part or the documentation part, it's almost just technical, like it doesn't feel that artistic at all. So I like that the project can just kind of like eat up all these different categories, and I don't have to worry about defining it.
Okay. Wow.
Sorry.
No, that was fantastic. And also very honest and sincere. Thank you. So I think those were my questions from my side, and I would very much like to open the discussion for our viewers. If they have any comments or questions for you. I see that Blau X wrote earlier, it reminds me of the Windrush scandal in UK in 2018. I'm not sure what part that was referring to in the chat. Are you familiar with the Windrush scandal in the United Kingdom? I'm a bit ashamed to say that I'm not.
No, actually, I'm not as well, and I'm also a bit ashamed.
Then we have something we can learn after this conversation. And we have a thank you, Rita and Sarai. Also from BlauX, thank you, BlauX. I hope I'm saying your name correctly. If there are no questions from the audience, maybe I can take the opportunity to ask some more. You were talking about the project in the future and what you want to do in autumn. Could you elaborate on what your plans are?
Yeah, no, just like I said before, for my artistic practice, like this was already satisfying enough, like from a very egoistic perspective. But it generated, at least in my perception, zero extra debate or conversation around the topic. And so now I would just really, really like to continue the conversation I've been having with the different organizations that showed interest to see what they feel would be the best way to bring this issue back to light, and how useful can the tools created during this phase of the project be. Of course, for me, planting action with a lot more flowers and a lot more people involved and a lot more participants with a more structured way of advertising would be great. But if the people that have been doing work on this feel like it may not bring just the right type of attention, or that it could put some of the participants that belong to these communities at risk, then the choice will be different, of course.
Okay. Looking forward to hearing more about it. Okay, then I'd like to say a very big thank you, Rita, for your time today and for this really enriching look into what you're doing and inspiring as well. And
I just came to boost you're giving me at the end of obviously. No, I'm kidding. Thank you so much for having me.
It was my pleasure, and thank you to the viewers as well for joining us tonight. Have a good evening. Bye-bye.